so working memory model, second topic, second specification point. I'm going to start with AO3. I'm actually going to start with saying what's really good about the working memory model, because actually it's this which leads us really nicely from our critique of the MSN last week. So it was Baddeley and Hitch that proposed the working memory model, and they developed it because many suggested that the MSM was a far too oversimplified account of short-term memory. So along came the working memory model, and it's clearly argued to be a much more valid model of short-term memory because it accounts for the very active nature of short-term memory. Not that we just hold information, but actually that we can manipulate information and work with information as well. Just to be clear, working memory doesn't mean that therefore the MSN is completely off our radar. It just means that we're looking at a slightly more sophisticated, more valid model of short-term memory. So in conclusion, we like the working memory model because it has evolved from the MSN simplified account, and it focuses on this multi-component nature of how our short-term memory works. Okay, so if you're going to use this as a strength in your evaluation of the working memory model, you need to pack it out and give examples. So here you might say, for example, the fact that we can process visual and verbal information. The working memory model accounted for that, which the MSN didn't. Okay? All right, let's just have a quick visual look at what the working memory model includes. So 4 components, okay? Central executive, visuospatial sketchpad, episodic buffer, and the phonological loop. And then, obviously, the next stage of memory is long-term memory. Please don't think that this means long-term memory is a part of the working memory system. We refer to these 3 components as the slave systems. They are the slave, of course, of the central executive. So let's quickly consider each of those in turn with some supportive evidence and an AO3 critique or evaluation for each. Okay, so starting with the central executive, you need to be able to use these terms. Stick closely to its purpose is to coordinate and filter information to the other components. It is that controller of information. It has to be able to process in all sensory forms because, of course, it's receiving all types of sensory information, touch, taste, sound, mental images, and it has an incredibly limited capacity. Stuff doesn't hang around in the central executive. It literally arrives and is sent on and moved on and filtered to one of the 3 slave systems. It can only deal with one strand of information at a time. That's how limited its capacity is. And evidence that supports that really limited capacity is that if you ask participants to do 2 tasks at once, so you get them to generate out loud a random list of numbers, say 5, 1, 9, 6, 2. They have to keep going and say them randomly, but at the same time get them with a keyboard in front of them to press simultaneously between a letter key and a number key and do that randomly as well. Doing both of those tasks at the same time is incredibly difficult. Why? Because both of them compete for that really limited resource of the central executive, and that's why it's hard to do both of them at the same time. And if you actually try that task and try to do it yourself, you will notice yourself hesitating as you try to do it, and that is clear evidence of the central executive trying to slow you down and trying to deal with just one of those strands at a time. What do we question? How do we evaluate the central executive? It is the least understood component of working memory. And the reason for that is because it has such a limited capacity, it's incredibly hard to test. And when you have a component that's incredibly hard to test, it means we just don't understand it very well. So ultimately, we can conclude that because we know less about the central executive, we can argue that it only really controls attention. It's not really a storage or capacity component. And then ultimately, the implication of that is, for the wider model, is that we can suggest that actually working memory model is not fully explained as such. Okay, moving on to the phonological loop. This is the component of our working memory model that deals with auditory information. Notice my terminology, storing and manipulating. Yeah, this is working memory. So we don't just hold information, we can manipulate it, we can work with it. Rehearsal will facilitate duration. It's a classic technique that we use in our phonological loop. We will rehearse a sound over and over and over to keep it active in our phonological loop. And we know from previous discussions that it has a limited capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of auditory information. The inner ear, the phonological loop, can be divided into 2 subcomponents. One is called the primary acoustic store and one is called the articulatory process. Now, a really easy way of just remembering this is that you've got one component that just stores and one component that processes, okay? So it's just getting your head around that part of the phonological loop is responsible for just literally holding that sound in the inner ear, whereas part of it is involved in the process of it, so enabling you to repeat that sound rather than just hold it, yeah? So we have a store and a process component of the inner ear. Evidence that supports the existence of the phonological loop. Case studies of brain damaged patients. There was particularly one of patient KF who completely lost their function of the phonological loop. They couldn't use their inner ear at all, but they had completely maintained their ability to maintain a mental image. So what does this kind of evidence suggest? Well, it confirms that we arguably have a valid multi-component model. In other words, that actually suggesting that there is a separate visual and a separate verbal component is a good thing. Although, just throwing in there, remember that's just one brain damaged patient, so it's, we can't overgeneralise. It's not fully representative. All right, so if we do look for other evidence that is a little bit more representative, you have studies where if we scan the brain and we ask a participant to do a verbal task, we see a very specific pattern of activation in that scan. Then if you ask them to do a visual task, we see a different pattern of activation. In other words, when you're using your phonological loop, you're using your inner ear, that is reflected differently in the biology of the brain compared to when you're using perhaps the visuospatial sketchpad. Again, that lovely evidence, which we've replicated and seen in many, many samples, suggests that we have a valid multi-component model of short-term memory. All right? I'm going to give you some examples of phonological loop tasks. I've added this in because I think this is a classic way you might get assessed in the summer. You might be asked to suggest an example of a verbal task that could test the phonological loop. Classic example here is asking a participant to listen to a series of numbers and letters being read out loud, and then being asked to recall what letter or number came after a prompted item. So essentially learning and repeating a string of information in your inner ear and then having to manipulate it. So for example, hearing out loud, DHQRUKCSH, pausing, waiting 10 seconds, and then asking the participant what item came after you. That is a classic example of using the phonological loop. Yeah? Really, phonological loop tasks are anything that involves speaking or reading of verbal information. Okay? Good. Okay, visuospatial sketchpad. This is our component which stores and manipulates visual and spatial information. And we use the VSS to navigate around the world, around us. And again, same capacity, 7 plus or minus 2. And it heavily involves the use of mental images or mental imagery. Just like the phonological loop, the inner eye is also split into 2, a cache and a scribe. The cache component of our VSS is responsible for visual data. If you look at a picture and you study it and then you're asked to recall colours or what was in the picture, the form of it, that's using the cache. The other component is the scribe, and this is the component of the VSS that deals with spatial relationships, knowing and looking at something and being able to judge how far away something is. Okay? So we have a cache and a scribe. They are both subcomponents of the VSS. How do we know that these subcomponents exist? We use something really important. You must get confident using this terminology, dual task research. Getting participants to do 2 things at once, just like the Baddeley evidence we looked at for the central executive. So what do we, when we conduct dual task research, we find supportive evidence for the existence of these two separate subcomponents. Participants will experience much higher interference and difficulty doing two visual data tasks, two different tasks that both demand the cache, versus they'll find it much easier, less interference, if they're doing one cache task and one scribe task, one visual task and one spatial task. Yeah? So the fact that they can do a visual and a spatial with more ease than doing two visuals or two spatials suggests that in the case of the two visuals or the two spatials, it's overloading the capacity of one of those components. Whereas if we do one visual and one spatial, we can do it successfully. So this confirms the existence of the separate systems. However, classic critique in memory research, these kinds of studies using dual task techniques are highly controlled dual tasks, and they often use stimulus and materials that we don't encounter in everyday life. For example, imagine a letter in your head and describe it. Follow a moving dot on the piece of paper in front of you. They're not really the typical things that we would encounter in real life. They are artificial. So your classic critique of VSS evidence is the fact that it lacks mundane realism. But look at the level of depth, not just it lacks mundane realism, explain what that means in the context of this research. And just as I did for the phonological loop, here are some example VSS tasks. I just said it already. You might be asked to test the scribe. You might be asked to follow a moving dot on a piece of paper in front of you. You might be asked to imagine the letter F, a 3D letter F in your mind's eye, and describe to the researcher the angles of a hollow letter F. You might study a painting for less than 30 seconds and then immediately recall items from that painting. Okay, you might create your own mental image. I might say to you now, I want you to imagine a book with a dancing elephant on top and sitting at the bottom of a tree. Okay, a bit abstract, but your creation of that image in your mind's eye is using your visuospatial sketchpad. Another really simple example of that is imagine all your homes right now. Can you count in your head how many windows your house has? Now, of course, to do that task, you've got to visualise your house in your VSS to be able to count the window. Okay, so just get familiar with giving examples of VSS tasks. And last but not least, and nowhere near to the depth of the other components, the episodic buffer was later added to the model because Baddeley noticed that the evidence coming in didn't quite fit just only having a PL and a VSS. What is the episodic buffer? It's a temporary storage system. It's a bit like a waiting room, a bit like a bridge between LTM and the other components of working memory. And its job is to just temporarily hold anything in working memory that isn't being used at that moment in time by any of the other components. That really is its sole purpose. How do we know it exists? To finish us off today, patients who don't have an LTM ability, so they have to totally rely upon their working memory system, seem to show a capacity of up to 25 items. Now we know that far exceeds what the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad could do on their own. So there has to be this existence of this additional temporary storage component called the episodic buffer in working memory. And that is everything you need to know on the working memory model. Okay, just